Recording is on. Excellent. Okay. All right. So, welcome to continuous product discovery in B2B, driving towards evidence based decisions using product science. Um, I myself am Holly Hester Riley. We also have Dina and Allison on the call. We'll do brief introductions in a minute. But we're really excited to have you guys here. Again, if you just joined, you can use the Q&A tool in the activities section to ask questions during the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer them as we go. And then there'll be a question and answer time at the end. So definitely, if we don't get to it during, if we don't end up answering your question during the session, we'll answer it at the end of the call. And this is being recorded. We'll send out the recording afterwards. We definitely heard from some people that weren't going to be able to make it because of a conflict, that they wanted the recording. So hope you all are comfortable with that. And with that, we'll get started. So our agenda for today is we're going to start with our introductions. Then we're going to talk about how do you make the case for continuous discovery in B2B. Then we'll talk a little bit about how you plan your discovery approach. Then we'll do more on how we actually execute the discovery research. We'll talk a little bit about using synthesized results to drive impact, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So let's start with some introductions. So I'm Holly. I'm a founder and coach at H2R Product Science. I was formerly product at post-IPO Shutterstock and at Unicorn Media Math. And I'm the host of the Product Science podcast. And I've also got Dina. Dina is a product manager and entrepreneur. She's a former strategy consultant and a former engineering leader at Google. And I've had the pleasure of working with Dina at a tech startup called Yourbase. I'm excited to have her on the team. And then we've also got Allison Cassing. Allison is a user researcher and a former product manager. I worked with Allison at Media Math, and after Media Math, Allison went on to successful ed tech startup Newsella. And she's been doing user research with us for many years. So we at H2R Product Science believe there's a science to high growth product management, and we offer training, coaching, and consulting services. And we're excited to share the things that we've learned along the way. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about some challenges that we see to doing continuous discovery in B2B. One of the biggest ones is your customer pool. So if you're working in B2C, you might have access to, thousands or millions of customers that are using your platform every day, and that gives you access to a lot of opportunities for research. But if you're working in B2B, it's not uncommon to have something on the hundreds scale, or maybe up to the thousands scale in B2B, and still be running a very successful business with lots of money flowing through the system. But it changes the nature of what research is. And I will answer this question on the fly. So B2B is business to business, and so that is when a business is selling to other businesses, and B2C is a business that is selling to customers that are not businesses. So if you're selling to somebody for the purposes of their job, then you're B2B. And one thing that we'll touch on a little bit later in the webinar is the differences between a B2B platform that has like large annual contracts and a small pool of customers, and a B2B platform that maybe serves small businesses and has a much larger pool of customers with smaller price points. Those companies that are B2B that have smaller price points and larger pools of customers can kind of seem a bit more like B2C as well. And so they have some sort of hybrid features. But we'll be talking about both. The core thing that we're talking about is when your users are using your software to get a job done. And so one of the big challenges is there's less people to be talking to. And we'll talk about the impacts of that as we go along. Another big challenge that I think many of you will resonate with is working with the sales team. So in B2B, the sales team is a really big part of what's happening. They can be protective of their client relationships, and it can be hard to get their buy-in to talk to customers. And sometimes they don't understand. And they just say, well, I talk to the customers all the time. Can't I just tell you what the customers are asking for and then you can go and build it? And unfortunately, that's not good product discovery because the sales team themselves are not trained in how to understand what a customer really needs, not just what they're asking for, and how to close a sale. And so that can be a challenge that people face in B2B product as well. Another challenge is marketing. So the marketing function um, can often have a really large voice. In B2B, you really have to partner with marketing, especially product marketing, to be communicating regularly with your clients. And that marketing team can really have a lot of sway. And it's important to build a good relationship with them to deal with that. And then finally, a really big challenge is customers having a lot of sway. And so if a customer says, yes, I like it, I want you to build this. If you build this, I will pay for it. That is one of the most common situations that we face in B2B, especially when there's large contracts and there's a big, key clients that we really want to keep happy. We can often fall into a trap of just building what they're asking for. And those of you who've lived through that will know that that leads to problems down the line. You can end up becoming a sales-led company instead of a product-led company, and that can sometimes create divergent tech stacks and difficulty maintaining the product, and a lack of vision for the future of where you're going. And these things can cause challenges down the line that we want to avoid with our product discovery work. So, how do you make the case for continuous discovery? This is definitely one of the things that we hear. We hear a lot of people asking is, I'm interested in doing continuous discovery, but how do I get buy-in? How do I get the okay and the green light from my boss? So, first, let's talk a little bit about continuous discovery. So, most teams today do some form of agile software development, meaning they ship code at least every 2 weeks, if not every day or even every hour. Uh, but that's not enough to build a great product. You can build software quickly and ship regularly and still be building the wrong thing. So we like to point to Marty Kagan's words on the matter. He says, rather than a product discovery phase where we come up with several weeks of validated product backlog items and deliver them to engineering, I encourage teams to do continuous product discovery, where we are constantly identifying, validating, and describing new product backlog items. And that's Marty Kagan, the founder of Silicon Valley Product Group. So how do we do that? What is continuous product discovery? Well, and why do we do it? The reason why we encourage continuous discovery is because you're constantly learning new things, whether you're learning something new about the technology stack that you're working with and what's something that you're able to build, or whether you're learning something new about your customer and what your customer needs, or maybe you're learning something new about the market and what your competitors are doing. You're constantly learning new things. And if you make a plan and then you stick to it for the next 6 months, then you're not using the valuable learnings that you're getting. And so and if you're not taking the time to learn new things regularly, then you're also missing that opportunity for continuous learning. And in today's market, you better believe that your competitors are learning fast and you need to be able to learn fast with them. So so that's why we talk about continuous discovery as really a way of doing continuous learning, and that is what we found is the most successful way to build successful products. So what you really need to do is to have a continual feedback loop between yourselves and your customer. And in B2B, your customer may be more than just one person, but the people that use your product. You need to have a regular feedback loop between them. And what we're going to talk about today really is how you set up that feedback loop and how you use it to get the most useful insights. Uh, So great. I like to say that all sounds really good, but then we usually have some kind of stakeholder, like a boss, an executive leader, a senior leader at the company, who's just standing there going, well, I know what you need to build. Why haven't you built it yet? Build it really fast. I'm looking at their watch and they're saying, get on with it, build the thing. So, how do we convince stakeholders like that, um, you know, with more than just theory? Because sometimes the theory can seem really abstract, and it's very easy for these stakeholders, especially if they're senior leaders at a company, to think that they already know what's needed and they don't need to test it and they don't need to question it. So, what do we do? So, how do you make space for more discovery? So, we view it as a continuous process, and we like to start small. Talk about the value, uh, and talk about not just building what you think people want, but what you think people will love. Also, talk about how it makes economic sense. Research is cheaper than building a product. And so, if you can point to any experiences, if you know within your company, maybe there is some project that failed in your recent company history, and you can actually point to that project and say, hey, um, you know, what happened over here? How do we avoid that happening again? And get people to question their assumptions. And then we also like to point to others and just, point to stories in the market about successful tech teams that have pivoted quickly and have become successful. And then start small and show the value. So one of my favorite ways is a one question intercept quiz. We did that when I was working at Shutterstock, where we were building a tool called Shutterstock Editor. And we decided that we wanted to know what people were going to do with the images they were downloading from our site. And so we put in a one question intercept quiz that interrupts when they're about to download an image and says, hey, what are you going to use this for? And it was just multiple choice, social media, print advertising, etc. And it was really easy for us to just put that up for a day for a certain portion of visitors and to gather valuable information. And that was a lot easier for us to get approval for because we didn't have to, go through building an entire survey and getting everyone's buy-in to what questions were going to be in it. We could just do that one thing really quickly and then show the value to our stakeholders and say, hey, here's what we've learned. And if it surprised them in any way, which it did, um, then that can give them sort of the itch for more research. Um, if you're having trouble with even doing that, we recommend starting with an informal user interview, meaning an interview that maybe is with somebody that you just know. So an interview that maybe you have a friend or a family member who meets the criteria or is somewhat lookalike to your user. And just starting with something like that can give you practice as a researcher or a product person and start to generate some interesting insights that can help you get buy-in for future work. And then similarly, the other way that we recommend starting small is gathering data from existing sources. So you've probably got a lot of sources inside your company. Maybe there's voice of the customer work going on. Maybe there's feedback buttons in your app. Maybe you're looking through customer support. But looking through that and making the effort to synthesize it in a way that shows the value for um, your key stakeholders is going to lay the groundwork for getting buy-in for that research. And then the other key element that we always recommend is to talk about the risks. So if you can get people into the mind space where they're thinking about the things that could go wrong and how likely those things are to go wrong, then they're more likely to buy into the need to answer questions and do research in the first place. So we have a favorite tool for this. It's called the pre-mortem risk assessment, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But in order to use the tool, first you have to know who to invite to the exercise. So there's a lot of different stakeholders in B2B that you should be working with. You've got marketing and sales. You might have customer success and support, client relationship management. Maybe there's a big operations component. You might even have a big component of legal or security. And what we recommend is that you get all of these people together into a room and you facilitate some exercises with them. And so you want to bring in um, anybody who is either going to be executing on the work, who's going to be doing work based on the insights that you gather, or anybody who has enough power to stop the work from happening. And um, and then you want to bring them together and do this exercise called a pre-mortem risk assessment. In the first part of it, what you do is you set up the scenario and you say, hey, we're going to imagine that we're 1 year in the future from launching this product and it's failed. And what we want to do is talk about why it's failed. We're going to act like a scientist and we're going to try to figure out what went wrong. And we use these 5 prompts as ways that things might go wrong that we want everyone to think about in each of these dimensions. So these are the 5 major risks. They come from Marty Kagan and SVPG. The first risk is usability. So we ask people to think about usability failures. So what are the trickiest parts of this to design? We ask them to think about feasibility failures. What is least understood about how to build this? We asked them to think about value failures. Even if we built everything we envision, why would users and buyers not buy this? We asked them to think about viability failures, which is why might this not meet the business goals? And finally, ethics failures. Why might this be ethically risky and what should we be doing to protect against that? So we ask the stakeholders who are in the room with us to write down different ways that things could fail, 1 idea per sticky note, and then they write those all out, and then they put them up on a map. And so that'll be the next slide. So we put an x-axis of the likelihood of this thing happening and a y-axis of the impact to the business if it does happen. So you're going to answer these 2 questions. And what we do is we say, okay, each person who wrote stickies makes an attempt to place the sticky on the map. And then after everyone has done that silently, then we go in and say, okay, let's all take a look at them and identify any that we have questions about where they were placed. And we'll talk about those ones and we may move them around. It's really all relative. So that's the thing is once you've placed the first one, then it becomes, well, is this more or less likely than that first one? Is it more or less impactful than that first one? So you can have that conversation. And then you, at the end of it, you're able to point to the things in the top right quadrant as your biggest risks. And by that point in time, these stakeholders who've come along with you for this, they've been a part of generating these conversations around what the risks are much more likely to buy into the research because they've submitted their concerns to you. They've shared with you what they think is risky. And now you're saying, hey, great, we have a way to de-risk this. We're going to design research to help us. And that gets people bought into doing the research. And so that's one of our favorite techniques for building buy-in. So for the rest of this, we are going to use a case study that we're going to point back to with some of our questions and examples when we can. And this case study comes from Allison and my time at MediaMath. This is an image of T1 Beta, which was a platform for marketers to manage their campaigns. And when Allison and I were working at MediaMath, the platform was about 2 years old and we were redesigning the front end of it, rebuilding it on a new tech stack. And we took that opportunity to rethink what the holistic experience was like. And so that was a really great experience for us to do continuous discovery work while we were designing. So with that, I will turn it over to Dina.
Thanks, Holly. So we're going to start thinking about how we're going to do the discovery. Whenever we think about discovery, we want to start with what we want to learn. So really that means defining our research goals. And we start with a few key questions. What are the top questions we want to answer with this stage of research? What are our riskiest assumptions? And what decisions do we need to make soon? So using the exercise that Holly mentioned to identify big risks and trying to craft the research around that. One thing that we find in B2B is that we're often crafting questions related to users' work lives. So how can we improve their day-to-day experience? And to do that, we really need to understand what are their workflows today, what gets in their way, how do they themselves define success? So here we have an example from MediaMath. So these 3 questions: how do users use the platform to manage their marketing campaigns today? which types of users are hands-on keyboard. So there may be multiple types of users, but we want to know the ones that are actively engaging. And how do our target users know when they are successful at their job? So one of the risks that Holly mentioned is, we have a cross-functional team involved in any new product, any new feature. So as we develop the research plan, it's really important to manage the stakeholder expectations and the relationships with those internal stakeholders. So if the product team develops a research plan, another department, you might have sales jumping in and saying, hey, while you're talking to the user, can you just add this one more question, etc. And then you can start to lose focus in the discovery process. So one technique that we really like is to invite everyone to submit their questions as part of their initial brainstorming workshop. So that is called question storming. And really, that's about collating the questions that you have as a group. So you aim for at least 5 questions each, 1 question per sticky note, and that includes both qualitative and quantitative questions. So the group is responsible for generating all these questions, and then the product team takes the next step to refine and take action on those questions to run the research and to move forward. And in a modern organization, decisions are made at every level. And at H2R, we believe that you can make decisions using evidence at every level. So at the leadership level, you're really trying to determine the vision and the target market. And that can best be done by gathering knowledge at a macro level. So maybe market trend analysis or quantitative, qualitative analyses of existing data. At the management layer, you may have the vision and target market handed down to you, but you still need to identify the pain points and the outcomes. And a few of our favorite testing methods for that are user interviews, surveys, and usage data. And then at the team level, you're really about making decisions, what you're building, what features you're building. And to do that, we really recommend user interviews, design research, usability testing, and of course, A/B testing. So of course, there's some fluidity to who's making which decisions and at which level. But this is a good guideline and roadmap for how we think about evidence-based decision making. And with that, I'll turn it over to Allison to talk a little bit more about the process of doing the discovery research.
All right. So next we'll talk more about implementing the actual research once you're ready to get going. So in discovery research, you'll want to use both qualitative and quantitative methods to get a full picture of experiences people are having and at what scale. So qualitative tells you the why and the how, and then the quantitative will tell you the how much, how many. And in this case, let's imagine you know what you want to learn. So you've gone through that process, you've identified your research questions, and then we'd recommend starting with qualitative research so that you know the stories behind the data once you get to that stage. So before you try and quantify it, understand what you're quantifying. And one big thing to note in B2B research is you're almost always going to have 2 parties to keep in mind. There's the chooser, or often choosers, who make the purchase decision, and then the user who actually uses the product. And it's fair to assume that in a B2B setting, there will typically be multiple stakeholders involved as choosers, and your research plan may need to keep in mind that these additional roles can impact the purchase and usage of your product. So as Holly mentioned, you may already have what you need to answer some of your questions, and this is a good way to start small. And if you have any, definitely pull from past related research also. But in B2B, customer support or account management, sales can be a treasure trove of information. And particularly ask for primary documents. That's always best. Actual customer emails, support tickets, so that you can see for yourself what customers are saying without being filtered through someone else's lens. So that's the sales team saying, I talk to customers all the time, this is what they're asking for. It's helpful if you can see the actual requests so that you can understand a little bit more of the context there. And when I was at Media Math, the customer support team helped me find tickets about particular data requests. I did the data and reporting there, and that really helped me understand what was missing from our current offerings for clients and that we'd want to take into consideration as we were building out our new platform. And then that gave me a jumping off point because I was able to then reach out to those customers to better understand why they were looking for that information. So it can really be a good connector. And then if, like me, then you need to go collect more information. It wasn't enough just to go through support tickets and the smattering of emails that you received. Then you need to identify who you want to talk to. And this is B2C, B2B. You need to figure out who you're going to talk to. And in the example I was just talking about, I reached out to those specific users who had additional data needs. And depending on your goals, you might want to talk to internal users, external existing users of your product, or people who haven't yet used the product at all. And one thing we've noticed is that often in B2B companies, you're so focused on your own customers that they'll often forget they can talk to potential users also. And that can be a really great learning experience, is to go outside of your customer base. But keep in mind also that with B2B, your research will probably need to be spread across users and choosers. So that requires more than you might need to do if you were just doing pure B2C. And then this is kind of in general in discovery. Recruiting can start really wide and get smaller. Different stages of discovery will have different levels of specificity. Initially, you might just know that you need to talk to people who recently took some action that you're interested in exploring. And then after you talk to that first group, other important characteristics will emerge. And in the next round, you'll want to make sure you act on your learnings from that first group. So how do you actually get your users to participate? So once you know what you want to learn and who you want to talk to, how do you actually get those people? In B2C, this is usually reaching out to current customers or a recruiting company, compensating them with money for their time. The difference in B2B is what was mentioned about customer relationships often being held by other teams. So sales, account managers, and they can sometimes be wary of having their clients participate in research, especially if they don't understand what the process is. So I found it can be both interesting and helpful to do research sessions with internal stakeholders so that they get a feel for what it's like and what it will be for their clients. And a bonus is that you'll probably learn something. So if there's someone who's expressed some interest in your research previously, reach out to them, have a session in a conference room. Then once you do complete some sessions, definitely share back the insights from those sessions so that internal contacts see how they're impacting and helping with the learnings. And especially if research interviews are not something that your organization is doing today, best advice is to really start small. And this is what Holly was talking about, informal or quick interviews. Make the first goal just to talk to someone and provide a good experience, and then more will follow from that. And also just people like feeling special. So when it comes to both internal and external communication, just emphasize how you really want to hear from this person because you really value their feedback. And that should help bring some people along. But if other teams are being really unreasonably controlling, and this does happen, and you can't get access to customers, then your best bet is to think about customers you are hoping to talk to and recruit non-customers in similar situations. So very tangibly, we're talking about using a third-party recruiting platform or service and screening for people similar to the customers you'd hope to speak to. And then actually executing the interview, these are just a few things in B2B. It's important to know how a purchase decision is made and who is involved in a decision. So if you're talking to the hands-on keyboard person, they might not actually have very much say in how that purchase decision happens. So concretely, you should ask about a recent tool purchase that happened at the company and how that happened. So as a B2B PM, you really need to learn both about product needs and organizational dynamics that might impact your product and users. And another thing that might happen in customer interviews, but especially in B2B settings where customer success meetings happen more regularly than research interviews, is you may run into participants making rather strong feature requests in the sessions. And the best way to handle this is just to validate that you see the problems they have, but not promise that you'll build any of their solutions. So just make them feel seen and definitely note it down, but don't make any promises in the moment. So how many is enough? One thing is with continuous discovery, the continuous part, always be talking. As much as you can, you want to make this a routine. And while often the pool may feel bigger in B2C research, I approach the how many is enough kind of the same way. You're not looking for scientific accuracy. You just want to learn enough to make a decision. So I like to do rounds of 3 to 5 people, pausing after each round to evaluate where we are with the learnings. And then you might need to talk to more people to handle choosers or users, depending on where you are in that situation. And if you do feel like your B2B customer pool is too small for even that, it's a good idea to talk to people outside of your customer base, as mentioned. Just make sure you're not building something. If your customer base is particularly small, you don't want to build to just your 3 current customers. You want to make sure that you understand what the rest of the market is or is not interested in. So tactically, compensation. So in B2C, participants are given cash or gift cards. For non-customers in B2B, you'll likely want to pay them the same way. But for a B2B customer, their incentive for participating is quite different. Many of them are just willing to participate out of goodwill. They want the tools they use to be better, and many will be comfortable participating during their workday, and they just want to make sure they have an impact on something that's a big part of their work life. But it is always nice to recognize people in some way for spending time, giving you information. You could still give them a nominal gift card for a coffee shop as a token of appreciation, or send over some swag. That worked very well at Newsella when I was there. That was very popular. Or maybe you would send a lunch for the team. It's also less common, but an option is to give away something like a free month of your service if that's something that works for your company. And when I was at MediaMath, I just sent thank you emails to the people I spoke to. And then I would also send an email along if something was released related to what we talked about. And this was just to make sure people felt appreciated, even though I didn't have budget approval for something specific to send them. And then just something else to consider in ways of keeping discovery continuous is customer advisory boards. And this can manifest in many forms, but you want to select a few key customers who provide helpful feedback to you and get them together every month, every other month, every quarter, depending on what feels right. And we had a customer advisory board at MediaMath, and it was a great way for the product team members, especially those less invested in their own discovery, to informally discuss ideas or show mock-ups to real users. And this kind of comes back to flattery. This can be a really nice way to show customers that you value their feedback on a regular basis and that you have that scheduled cadence of meetings, and that can really facilitate your team getting into the habit of hearing from customers on a regular basis. And with that, we'll go back to Dina to jump into some quantitative data discovery.
Thanks, Allison. So sometimes there might be a way to get the information you need through data. You might be able to pull a report, look at analytics, run some SQL queries, the like. And that's a really important tool in the toolbox. So we'll briefly go over some favorite methods there. Of course, modern products have a lot of product analytics, usage data, but one common misconception is that, in B2C, you might, for example, want to optimize the time spent on your website. But in a B2B setting, that might not be as relevant or as accurate of a goal. So one recommendation we have is to really think about the North Star metric for your product and how it relates. And from Sean Ellis from Hacking Growth, North Star metric is a single metric that best captures the core value that your product delivers to customers. And we know that it can be more challenging in a B2B setting with a limited number of users to identify patterns and customer segments. It can be really useful to identify, for example, the number of customers that are receiving value and not just the number of users. So if you want to talk with us more about North Star metric, feel free to reach out. We love working with folks on that. And then A/B testing. So volumes can tend to be lower with product and user data. So teams might think they can't do A/B testing, and that might be the case sometimes. But if you have a large enough user base, you can definitely do A/B testing in B2B scenario. So for example, at Shutterstock, even though it was a B2B company, there's a large volume of small business users. So A/B testing did make a lot of sense for areas like checking copy, button placement, etc. As another example, at MediaMath, the volume of users signing in wasn't necessarily very large, but so it wasn't something the team relied on for a lot of decision making, but it was useful as a data point when debating between options or considering a particular feature implementation. Depending on your setup, you may also want to keep in mind giving users in the same company the same experience for a sense of consistency. So, they might be working on a similar project and being able to collaborate would be important. All right, so we've done a lot of discovery, both qualitative and quantitative. What do we do next? Over to you, Holly.
Yeah. So you need to synthesize those results to drive impact, and you need to do that regularly and consistently. So what does that look like? So it's not enough to be right. You also have to be persuasive. So it's not enough to gather the evidence. You also have to share the evidence in a way that changes hearts and minds. So we have a couple of key ways that we like to do this. One of them is to share direct quotes from the research immediately or shortly after doing the research. So this is an example of a slide that we've put together when we were doing work for a dev tool startup on sort of gathering quotes from the research that emphasize specific concepts that we were hearing. So in this case, we were hearing there's a pressure to release quickly, and we pulled out some quotes that illustrated that pressure to release and some relevant information about who said it. So, what kind of company were they at, or what key characteristics did they have? Another example that we like to use is user dimensions. So we call what we call user dimensions is basically a characteristic of users that can be different for different people in your user base, and for which the differences make a difference. So some of you may be familiar with Jeff Patton's quote, what are the differences that make a difference? And the idea is you're thinking about among your user base, what are the differences in those users that make a difference in what they need from your product or how they think about your product? And we'd like to plot that on a line and say, okay, for this characteristic, what's a low and a high value? And then share these things about it. So this is our template for it, and I'll also share on the next slide an example where we were doing education and we were looking at the characteristic of willingness to pay. And so the user dimension was willingness to pay, and the range went from none to high investment. And we shared for each of them how do we describe that value, how do we set that, the guardrails for which level of it a user falls into, and then we'll often share quotes from users that actually fit that value. So for example, if you look at invested student, we had one person say, I can't put a price on learning, and that really pulled together, indicative of that that value. And so we'll often do this across multiple user dimensions to illustrate the types of users we're seeing in our research and how they feel about different things. Another key thing about synthesizing results for impact is to share your results regularly. So a common mistake that we see is a research team putting together a big report at the end of a major push to answer a question. And that can work, but what we've found is that if you want to get buy-in and you want to change people's minds about things, it's far better to share those results really regularly so that um, the stakeholders who are getting new information have time to process and think about it, to ask you new questions that they might want in the research, and for you to have an interactive back and forth that really gets their buy-in. And the way that we most prefer to do this is with what we call the built learned planning demo. So most teams already demo what they built. We suggest expanding it to also talk about what you learned and what you're planning. And in doing that, not only are you regularly sharing your learnings at the end of every sprint, but you're also socializing the idea that when we learn new things, we also change our plans. And so that addresses another common challenge we see, which is teams that go out and do research, but kind of just use it to validate their existing plans and don't change what they're doing. So we recommend sharing what you built, what you learned, and what you're planning. And then at the end, you need to tie that research back to the opportunity work that you're doing in the first place. So we'd like to talk about what we call an opportunity assessment. And that's basically looking at who are the users for your product or your feature idea or whatever solution you're looking at. What are their behaviors and attitudes? What is the product idea that you're evaluating? What are its strengths and weaknesses? And if you have an existing product, how is it going today? What is the market that you're in? Get an understanding of how many users are like the ones that are your ideal user. What is their competitive landscape, and what are your competitive advantages? And so you want to bring your research back to answer these questions. You want to be tying that research back to who the user is, to what the market size is, to what your product strengths and weaknesses are. And then secondarily, you need to answer, can this company capture the opportunity? And so you want to look at what are the assumptions and risks? What are the things that can get in the way of you capturing this opportunity, whether from a feasibility standpoint or usability or any of those other risks that we talked about? And you want to assess your capabilities and constraints. And so you really want to get a sense of, what can we do? What infrastructure do we have? What team members, what skills do we have on our team? And do we actually think that we're positioned to capture this opportunity? And use that research to then make recommendations about whether to invest, persevere, pivot, or kill. And that's something that we feel very passionately about, coming back and having an opinion. Not expecting your boss to tell you what to do with it, but saying, okay, based on this research, I think we should put more resources on this project, or I think we should pivot. So you need to have that come back. And finally, I wanted to share, just as a way to tie this all up, we have a tool we call the Product Science Success Path, and that is 5 stages from agile product development through product discovery, continuous product improvement, high impact experimentation, and finally high growth product leadership. And those are the 5 stages of practicing continuous discovery that we've seen in maturity model seen it as a maturity model across organizations. So I wanted to take a minute to just share with you. I'm just going to go really quickly, and then we'll go into the questions. But basically, the starting point, the first stage is agile product development. And if you're in that stage by asking yourself, do you develop and release new software on a regular basis, either in sprints or continuously? If you do, then you're at least in agile product development. And in order to get to the next step, you need to talk to customers. So the next step is product discovery. And to ask if you are doing that, ask yourself, do you plan and conduct research with users to help you design and build the right product? And okay, so great. At this stage, you're doing some research, but you might not be doing it continuously. You might be doing it in a sort of a project phase. And so the next step for you there is to work on doing it continuously. And so we recommend setting a learning goal and using the Built Learn Planning demo as your next step if that's the stage that you're at. The third stage is continuous product improvement. And so that's coming up a level to say, okay, are you doing it continuously? Do you plan and conduct research with users at least each sprint? If you do, then you're getting the benefit of at least one type of continuous product discovery, but you might not be getting the full benefits of multiple modes of product discovery. And so what we see here is commonly a company that leans too heavily in quantitative or qualitative. Maybe they do all qualitative and they're not looking at data. Maybe they're only looking at data and they're not really doing much qualitative. Or they're just not branching out into new ways of testing. Maybe towards Audrey's question, maybe they're doing only usability testing and they're not really doing experiments around opportunities and trying to size opportunities against each other. So we'll talk about that a little bit in the Q&A section. But if you're in this stage, then we recommend using the pre-mortem risk assessment as the next step that you add to your company's process in order to help you brainstorm a wider array of research questions and research ideas that you can use to experiment. And then the fourth stage is high impact experimentation. So this is the place where you're actually really doing it well. This is the place where you can ask yourself, do you commonly find that once you release software to your users, your data shows that they use it in the ways that you expected? So what will often happen here is the product manager and the user researchers and the UX designers will have a strong hypothesis about what's going to happen, and they'll actually see that hypothesis proven out in the work because they're doing such consistent, good, continuous discovery work that by the time they actually build software, they know what's going to happen with that software. And that is great, but a lot of times what will happen there is the senior stakeholders at a company, senior leadership may not be on the same page. Maybe they have a strong opinion about what's going to happen and you're having a hard time convincing them otherwise, even if you knew what was going to happen. And so what we recommend there is to make sure that you're engaging key stakeholders with product discovery and its results. So it's really important to get them bought in early on, to get them to be asking questions and thinking about risks, and to have them interacting with the research on a regular basis so that they're building that muscle of developing questions and answering them and validating them. And then the final stage, once you're doing all that, is high growth product leadership. So the way you know you're at this stage is, do your stakeholders trust you to make good decisions and consistently deliver on the desired outcomes for your users and product? And if you're at this stage, then not only are you as a team generally understanding what is likely to happen with the products that you launch, but also you're gaining trust from your senior stakeholders and they're starting to turn to you and ask you for that research and say, what insights do you have around this? And they're expecting that you'll continuously deliver good results on your products. And that's the stage that we want to help all teams get to. And once you're there, we recommend that you continue learning, you stay curious and authentic, and you start thinking about sharing out what you've learned with other people in your organization. So with that, I want to leave you with a quote from one of my favorite people, Richard Feynman, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, who says that the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. And he teaches a lot about the scientific method, and so we like to keep this in mind. It's all about not fooling yourself, not just having confirmation bias, and thinking about how you can prove that, prove yourself wrong even. So thank you guys for joining us. I hope that we've answered some of your questions, and with that, we'll go into Q&A. And I'd love to hear from you guys. We'll answer Audrey's question first, and then if anyone else has a question as well, feel free to put it in the chat, or we'll check and if there's anything else that we got. So Audrey asks, I'm interested in assumption opportunity testing, as Teresa Torres describes. For example, her doing scheduling for job seekers and hirers to see if more people got jobs and if they should build a scheduling feature. This is far outside traditional research like usability. How do you think about that? So we definitely are big fans of opportunity testing and assumption testing. I generally think of it as designing an experiment to see if an opportunity exists. So one of my favorite sort of ways to do that is actually to say, hey, maybe I'm trying to figure out whether people would use a certain feature. So can I can I put like a drop down button, or can I put a way to access that feature in the UI even without building the feature? And do prototype testing and see if people click it, if what they think it's going to do, whether they interact with it. And then another thing that we'll often do is on the opposite direction. We try to say, okay, we're assuming that this is valuable, but maybe it's not needed. So maybe we'll put in front of them a prototype that doesn't have the feature that everyone at the company thinks is needed. And we'll ask them to achieve a goal and see if they can still achieve the goal without that feature. So those are two different directions that we sometimes go in when we're trying to assess whether people will do a thing, whether they will use an opportunity, regardless of the usability of it. And when we're doing that in B2B, we're often doing it in a very qualitative way. So, you might sum up across interviews how many people do use a feature or how many people get something done without the feature. But that, we're not usually having enough data to sort of do like A/B testing around it or things like that. And I think this is a place where we really have to get creative. So a lot of times it sort of starts with, what is the question we're trying to answer? And then can we sort of create an environment in which we're getting as close as we can to mimicking the real world and see whether people actually achieve the outcome that we're curious about. So I think I wish it were easier to sort of be like, here's a great example. But it's a very sort of, what is the situation kind of thing. Dina and Allison, do you guys have anything to add about opportunity testing? We definitely do use the opportunity solution tree with many of our clients. And so we definitely recommend that's a great way to map out what are the opportunities and to identify, okay, how do we compare opportunities to each other instead of comparing solutions to each other? And it's really all about framing the right question in the first place, I think.
Thanks.
Thank you. And Sean asks, research is cheap. You say research is cheaper than building a product, but what about the opportunity cost of poorly structured research? Is there a way to verify your research will allow you to learn faster than building? And I think that's such a good question, and it's sort of the opportunity cost of poorly structured research is missed learnings and missed opportunities and time spent on that research. And I think we believe so strongly in the value of good research that we would generally say it's worth it because you'll learn how to do better research only by doing research. So it's kind of a catch-22 in that if you start off doing research poorly, people around you can think research is useless. But the only way to get better at research is to practice it. So we recommend that you push through and trust that you'll get better at research and that it will be cheaper than building. I hope that helps. And Svetlana asks, in terms of putting together client advisory boards, any advice about the recommended cadence and topics you can cover or the type of feedback you can request? And for that, I would say when we were at Media Math, we had a customer advisory board, and we tried to make sure that we were inviting them to answer questions at least once a quarter, but we would often ask them for more frequent feedback when we were working on particular features that they were close to. And you can really do anything from just generally asking them, their thoughts about the industry and the space and where things are going, what kind of decisions they're making in their organization about, which software tools to use in the first place, down to specifics of, can you achieve this goal with this prototype? And this sort of anything that you can think of that you're trying to answer, you can use a customer advisory board to help you answer. One challenge with customer advisory boards is you're often using the same people over and over again. And so you do want to expand and make sure that you're also covering people outside of the customer advisory board on occasion. And then TJ says, we just completed our first empathy mapping exercise with sales and are trying to figure out how to turn the learnings into tangible next steps. Any tips? So I think I love that. Empathy mapping, for anyone who doesn't know, is where you map out what users are seeing and saying and hearing, and what's influencing them, and what their pains and gains are that that drive their behavior. And so what my favorite thing to do coming out of an empathy map is to synthesize the insights into what is the biggest pain point that customers have and what is the biggest desired outcome that they have, and is that something that's consistent across users, or is it something that we have to segment users in order to find consistency? So that's a good next step to take. Thank you guys. I know we're out of time, so if you need to go, totally understand. If anyone has any other questions, feel free. We'll hang around for a few minutes to answer any more questions that people have. But thank you so much. You guys have been a great audience, and I'm happy to share with you all.
Thank you. Sean, did you want to review? I see you had 2 other questions as well. Suggestions for how to measure the rate or amount of learning, and can you use Bayesian updating to incorporate new data with stakeholder priors?
Yeah, good questions. So measuring the rate or amount of learning, most commonly what I've seen is either measuring how often you're talking to customers, like how often you're doing user research interviews, how often you're running prototype tests, or those are sort of proxies. But I feel like, of course, you could be doing those things and not learning new things if you're just sort of running through the rote experience. And so I think the other thing that I think about is like, how many interesting slides do I have for the Built Learn planning demo? And is that a good pace? In terms of Bayesian updating, can you say a little more? I remember learning about Bayesian statistics in college, but it's been a while.
So it was in particular reference to the hippo problem. You've got a senior stakeholder that says, go that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in theory, that would be in Bayesian, that would be called a prior. So that might be based, and you don't know. And sometimes those people actually have talked to a lot of people and they've distilled for you 15, 20, 30 conversations, right? So one of the challenges is, do you weight that equivalent to a dozen observations, 2 dozen, whatever, but there's some weight you put on that. And then as you're collecting other data, as you're talking to other people, so one conversation that contradicts it probably doesn't remove it, but you might downgrade it slightly. So Bayesian updating is a way to kind of incorporate new information and say, we think that the answer is kind of trending here or there. And if you find confirming evidence, then obviously it leads you more in that direction. But you're looking for a mix of confirming and disconfirming evidence, and you're putting weights. So for example, if you're getting hearsay, you talked about the importance of getting direct or primary sources. You might underweight hearsay from a salesperson until you've actually developed confidence that they're actually giving you a good and accurate assessment. And again, you're looking at somebody that might be a condensation point for many observations. And so when they come and they say X, that might actually count for 10X, right? And that's something you would learn over time. So it's just a way to take, trying to figure out what's the quality of the observation or the input you're getting and putting a weight on it. And then updating that as you get more information, as you're adding more information over time.
So
doesn't
then I would
seem
say
like
yes.
anybody's looking at this problem. I mean, it doesn't seem like anybody's So it's used in other fields to
Mhm.
essentially mix old and new data.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that we're doing that on I think that people in product do that without being quantitative about it. So, you know, it comes out in presentations, it comes out in build, learn, planning demos. Like we are updating our mental map of what's going on, but we're not usually like creating a spreadsheet and assigning weights to things.
Right. So if you're going to
Yeah,
take the hippo on, it seems to me you actually need to directly confront and say, we've actually, now, qualitative is not the same as quantitative, but nonetheless, you might think about enumerating. We've talked to these 6 people that seem to fit your target customer criteria, and none of them think your idea is good. Should we
Right.
update it?
Yeah.
Yeah, one example that I've used is, you kind of have like a persona that you've crafted of your ideal customer, let's say, and, things they've said or things that you think are true about them. And as you continue and learn new things about them, you may go back and kind of update that artifact and incorporate some of the newer things that you've learned. So that's how I've kind of seen that process look in real life.
Mhm.
Yeah, the Bayesian assumes you've actually got a population that may have multiple characteristics. The risk of the persona is you're like the statistician that's trying to wade a river that's on average 3 feet deep, right?
Mhm.
The average is not always indicative of what's going on in that riverbed.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about. Um, one of the things that I often say, like Allison said, is you know, we're trying to gather enough data to make a decision and move forward. We're not trying to be, you know, publishing a scientific paper. So it's something where in practice in the day-to-day product manager life, we recommend that you sort of do enough to make a decision, especially if it's a two-way door decision, and keep going. But I think from a theoretical place, it's interesting to think about.
So
Bayesian.
Bayesian's actually about proceeding on just enough data. It's not about a legal level of proof. It's about making a good enough decision rapidly. So that's why they put numbers on it.
Okay, got it.
I'm not trying to be perfect or right. I'm trying to get a little better with each observation.
Just enough. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, definitely interesting. And you also asked, can you measure to category definition complexity taxonomy? Can you say a little more about that?
So Rummelt and Norman did an old paper on one of the ways to measure learning is to look at how people reorganize their categories, right? And so if you've got some kind of discrimination test for, is this a customer of ours? Do they have a problem we can solve? And I'm talking more about B2B.
Yeah.
Then one way to measure learning might be, are our discriminants getting richer and more detailed? Are we able to, in other words, instead of calling every 4-legged animal a cat, maybe we now recognize dog and cow and pig. And the same way with customers in the beginning. And I think the persona actually drives you to a simplification that in B2B may be problematic. So it's a way to kind of, all I'm suggesting is you might look at, are we asking more, do we have a richer and more potent set of customer diagnostic questions or customer qualification questions as a result of the research that are potent compared to when we started? Because now we've got a richer taxonomy or a richer kind of ontology of what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely something I know, you know, even just recently when Dina and I were working together at the DevTools startup, that was definitely an outcome of our learning was, you know, constantly refining the customer profile and the categories and understanding who is and isn't an ideal customer for us. So I think that makes sense.
Okay. Well, this is really good talk. The thing I really liked about it was you talked a lot about intermediate results. You talked about treating the product team as peers, getting a lot of interaction, and kind of, instead of coming with a definitive answer at the very end, you're kind of your back and forth along the way, which I think I agree with your assessment. I think it allows you to build more influence and to make more rapid, smaller course corrections than trying to produce some kind of report. That's the final, bound leather volume, stone
Right.
tablet thing. So I
Yeah.
really, I thought it was a very practical briefing. I appreciated it.
Well, thank you for joining. We appreciate you being here.
All right.
All right. Have a great
Are you
day.
I missed the first 10 minutes. Are you going to make the copy of this available?
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks very much.
Yeah. Thank you as
Bye.
well. Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right. We will stop there.